Great. We're on our way. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's our pleasure to welcome you today as we're starting the event and allowing attendees to join us. We'd just like to go over a little bit of the housekeeping for today. If you're speaking or taking the floor, please unmute yourself and turn on your video. We'd love to see your face. Please remember to keep time. And if you have comments or questions to our panelists, please ask them in the Q&A. If you ask them in the chat, please make sure that you tell us who you're asking the question to so that we can direct it to the right person. And please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear a little bit about who you are and where you're from. If you need interpretation, we have interpretation in English, Spanish, and French. Please click on the globe icon to access the interpretation. When you click on the globe, you can then select your preferred channel for the language, and then you'll be able to hear our wonderful interpreters. We'll be starting in just a minute. We'd just like to give people a few more minutes to come in. Hello, and once again, welcome to our event. We'll be starting in just a moment, but before we start, I would like to go over some of the housekeeping for today's event. We'd like to ask you that if you're speaking to please unmute yourself, and when you're not speaking to please mute your mic. If you're presenting, please turn your video on. We'd love to see your face. Please remember to keep time. And if you have comments or questions, please ask them in the Q&A and ensure that they include a direction as to who they're being asked to. Please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to hear about you, who you are, and where you're from. And if you need interpretation, the interpretation is available in English, Spanish, and French. Please select your English channel by using the globe at the bottom of the screen. As we're having some attendees join, I think we'd like to give it a minute more before we start.
Good morning.
Good morning, Melania.
Hola, David. Buenos días.
Buenos días, Melania. We're just waiting until we start, but interpretation is on. So Melania, if you'd like to switch to Spanish. I think we're just about ready to begin. We'd like to thank you for your patience and for your support, and we'd also like to welcome you to today's event. I have the pleasure today of being your moderator, together with Joji Carino, and I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from around the world. It is my pleasure to open today's event and to welcome you to this Indigenous Peoples' Rights and Development on the Ground, Indigenous Data to Secure Rights. During today's side event, local Indigenous leaders from Latin America, Africa, the Arctic, and Asia will share their experiences in advocating for the respect and implementation of their rights, and the critical role of the Indigenous Navigator in monitoring the rights of Indigenous peoples and enhancing Indigenous peoples' opportunity to collect data on their situation. My name is David Berger, and I'm an advisor with IVGIA, the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, and we would like to thank the Indigenous Navigator for organizing this event. I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, who will give us our opening remarks. This is Ms. Joji Carino, who will deliver for us an overview and a discussion on today's theme and topic. Joji is a senior policy advisor at Forest Peoples Program, and she is the convener of the Indigenous Navigator Consortium. She has been an active campaigner and advocate over the last 3 decades on Indigenous peoples' human rights at the community, national, and international levels. She is an environment and development educator and researcher with expertise on Indigenous knowledge and traditional occupations, cultural and biological diversity, international standards on forests, water and energy, extractive industries, and corporate accountability. An additional focus of her work is community-based monitoring and information systems as tools for local governance. Dear Joji, it is a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, David. Welcome, everyone. So let's begin again by greeting each other to this side event on the Indigenous Navigator. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. I'm honored to be giving some opening remarks for this important event. From my experience, as now an aging activist and advocate for Indigenous peoples' rights, some processes and tools stand out as contributing so much to my own learning and empowerment. Surprisingly, this came in the form of developing and using indicators relevant for Indigenous peoples. The conscious effort of documenting the details about our everyday lives, about the state of nature and our lands, waters, territories, and resources, about government policies and laws affecting us, or about the relevance and effectiveness of mainstream education and the transmission of traditional knowledge and the enrichment of Indigenous languages. The UN Permanent Forum, from its very first session, understood the importance of specific data on Indigenous peoples to deeply understand our community realities, to guide our own local self-governance, to situate Indigenous peoples vis-a-vis the rest of society through robust disaggregated data, and to inform national and global policies for transformational change. Thereafter, a process was initiated to systematically empower Indigenous organizations to strengthen community-based monitoring and information systems, eventually giving birth to the Indigenous Navigator. Today, Indigenous peoples in Bangladesh, Bolivia, Cambodia, Cameroon, Colombia, Kenya, Nepal, Peru, Philippines, Suriname, and the United Republic of Tanzania, and many other countries, have begun using the Indigenous Navigator to monitor their rights and development. The national and community-based data generated from its tools reinforces Indigenous peoples' direct exercise and assertion of our rights, using technologies and frameworks which are grounded on the human rights-based approach and supporting advocacy and meaningful participation in decision-making. Grounded on indigenous values and cultures, the Indigenous Navigator is providing digital tools directly to indigenous communities, supporting their own innovations towards contemporary problem solving through community assessments, mapping, environmental tracking, support for livelihoods and social enterprise, thus empowering them to be well-informed actors in addressing the multiple crises confronting our peoples and nature. Conceived as an enabling open source tool that can be used by indigenous peoples worldwide, the Indigenous Navigator framework builds on international human rights instruments such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and ILO Convention 169, the relevant Sustainable Development Goals and indicators, thus empowering indigenous communities to hold duty bearers accountable for implementing their global and national obligations. Today, indigenous leaders from the Sami Council, the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Okani in Cameroon, and Onamyap will share their stories about the contributions and challenges faced in applying the Indigenous Navigator in different regional and national contexts. We can learn from their experiences about how to further improve and extend the possibilities of using the Indigenous Navigator with strategic support from the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The world still lacks the full picture regarding the marginalization and discrimination against indigenous peoples due to lack of disaggregated data and the lack of accessible tools and resources for their use. Despite advances in recent years, indigenous peoples still lack full visibility and continue to be left behind, which is undermining equitable implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how can we make the Indigenous Navigator a transformative tool for more peoples and communities in the coming years? At this 21st session of the UN Permanent Forum, let us review how far we have traveled in addressing the outstanding gaps in providing better data on the situation of indigenous peoples. Today, the UN State of the World's Indigenous Peoples report is being published every 3 years, containing data on indigenous peoples in the various thematic areas under the forum's mandate. The Permanent Forum has issued over 130 specific recommendations on data collection and disaggregation, including a recommendation on the Indigenous Navigator at its 16th session, stating the Permanent Forum welcomes the progress made in the development of community-based tools to monitor the implementation of the declaration, the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and encourages collaboration and contributions from governments, the agencies of the UN system, indigenous peoples and civil society organizations to the Indigenous Navigator framework and other tools to strengthen community-based monitoring of global commitments made under the Declaration, the UN Conference, and the SDGs. At its 17th session in 2018, another recommendation supported the strengthening and further application of community-based mapping, monitoring, and information systems as complementary evidence bases for assessment and monitoring the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the post-2020 biodiversity framework, urging governments and donors to support community-based monitoring and information systems, citizen science, and the democratization of information technologies as complementary to national and global statistical and information systems, and also to prioritize capacity building and funding for such initiatives. So finally, this event aims to bring together multiple stakeholders, including governments, NGOs, international organizations, and indigenous peoples, to enhance dialogue and to find concrete pathways to improving indigenous peoples' rights and well-being with the support of tools like the Indigenous Navigator. I very much look forward to our productive discussions today. Thank you very much for listening. Back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Joji. And thank you for these really powerful words and essential reflections, and for sharing with us the foundation upon which the Indigenous Navigator has been designed and built. It is truly critical that data is generated by and for Indigenous peoples to amplify their voices and their realities and ensure that they are not left behind, are not pushed behind, and that they remain and become more visible. We'd now like to turn the floor to Vicky Talley-Corpus. She's an Indigenous leader and Indigenous peoples human rights defender. Vicky is a Kanaka A. Igorot from the Cordillera region of the Philippines. She is the executive director of Tebteba, the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group on the Sustainable Development Goals, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She's also a former chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Vicky, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we're very glad to turn the floor to you.
Thank you very much, David. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all of you who are now participating in this event. I think that it's very important that we hold this event in conjunction with the UN Permanent Forum session. And as you have heard Joji earlier, she mentioned about all the recommendations from the Permanent Forum regarding the need to disaggregate data on Indigenous peoples, and also mentioning the Indigenous Navigator in the 2017 recommendations. So we're happy about this, that there is this recognized need, but we do recognize also that we still have a very long way to go. The Indigenous Navigator, there's no question about it, has really led the process of trying to push for making Indigenous peoples more visible and disaggregating data on Indigenous peoples. But as you can see, most of the efforts that are happening now are really pushed by Indigenous peoples themselves. No, so the Navigator is one attempt of ours to build upon the community-based monitoring and information systems that many of us have been implementing even before the Navigator came into the picture. And the whole idea behind this is that the Indigenous peoples themselves will monitor how their rights are being protected, respected, and fulfilled, and identify what are the challenges so that they can bring these challenges to the relevant actors. No, we have the monitoring process in itself is very empowering, mainly because the Indigenous peoples learn what the situation is in their own communities. You know, as this is not a very good metaphor, but as they say, you know, when you go into a battle, you have to know exactly what your terrain is. No, and that is what the monitoring system is doing. We are trying to see what is the terrain of Indigenous peoples, what is the real situation in their communities, and the Indigenous peoples themselves are the ones doing this. No, so the mapping processes, the resource inventories that they do, the analysis, looking into what are the existing national laws or even local ordinances that either promote the rights of Indigenous peoples or violate the rights of Indigenous peoples. These are actions that are very empowering. No? And as you will be hearing from our panelists today, I'm sure they will be sharing what they have learned. They have learned more deeply about their own communities as well as their own countries. No, I think the process of knowing the policies is in itself very empowering, because you exactly will understand when we say that indigenous peoples are subjected to structural discrimination, because many of the laws that are existing in our countries today are still very racist or very discriminatory against indigenous peoples, even if our constitutions say that human rights should be respected. All constitutions will say that, but the laws that are in place still have to be revised or amended so that that kind of discrimination will cease to exist. But the other empowering process that I have seen, because we have been, of course, talking to all the partners, and our partners are very much involved. All of you are very much involved in the various global processes. The other empowering factor is really the capacity to dialogue directly with the governments, or even with businesses, who are the ones also involved in the state of our human rights. So I think by having that knowledge of what's happening in your community, it gives you the confidence to be able to talk directly to the governments at various levels and tell them exactly what is happening and what needs to be done to address the problems that you have seen. As you know, in the indicator, in the navigator process, we use the indicator framework, which looks at structural indicator, which means the laws and the policies, the process indicators, which means the activities, the actions being taken by the governments to be able to fulfill their obligations to human rights conventions, and the outcome indicators, how indigenous people's rights are enjoying the rights that are inherent to them and that are also recognized globally, and of course hopefully nationally. So these are the various indicators that we look into, and on the basis of this, reports are developed that will be fed into for a wider audience. And this kind of activity, this kind of program that we have done has really borne very fruitful results in the countries where this is piloted. And the piloting is not just limited to the generation of data, the dissemination of this data and information. It also includes implementing small projects on the ground to achieve some of the sustainable development goals. And the third part is, of course, the global advocacy that we are doing. Like this forum that we have today is part of our global advocacy work to make the world know about the activities of the Indigenous Navigator. And we have to thank the European Commission, the European Union, for supporting this effort, because the achievements cannot be underestimated. I would like to also, of course, I would like to hope that we will be able to expand the use of the navigator to other countries. We know that the resources are needed for indigenous peoples in the different countries, for them to be able to gather and generate the data and share more widely the data. And these resources are quite limited, and that's why we are only limited to these countries that was mentioned earlier by Georgie. Our dream, our vision is that we will be able to generate even bigger resources so that we will be able to cover wider areas, more countries in the world. And on that basis, the data that we generate, we will be able to really show global trends. We cannot say that of course we can, the data that we have generated now will show what is happening in the various countries, but we cannot claim that this is very, very global, because we have to have more countries to be able to really show the global trends that are happening. So our dream is to reach that stage, and of course to be able to engage more actively with other institutions, the commissions on human rights, the human rights institutions in our countries, as well as the regional institutions. We we are aware that some of the data that we have generated have also been used by Indigenous peoples in their campaign, to stop some human rights violations that are happening, whether this is in relation to displacement of Indigenous peoples because of the establishment of national parks or national conservation areas, or because of extractive industries. And of course, even the situation now, the COVID situation, data has been generated as well to show how COVID has impacted Indigenous people's communities. So it's regularly, we are how do you call it? We are always up to date, As mentioned earlier by Georgie, we are looking at the situation related to climate change, to biodiversity erosion, but now, of course, with the sustainable development goals, Here in the Philippines, for instance, we just had a meeting with some of the government authorities as well as the UN, and there is going to be a meeting between Indigenous peoples, the Commission on Human Rights, as well as the various human rights organizations, together with the Philippine Statistics Administration. This is the one that gathers the statistics, and we hope that we will be able to use that meeting to further push for better disaggregation of data of Indigenous people situations in the Philippines. So I think that's the other part that we want to hear more about, how the government is responding to the data that we have been generating and showing, within the country and even outside of the country. And this brings me back finally to the permanent forum meeting that's happening now. We should really be able to get more more concrete actions from the side of the permanent forum, so that even the statistics division of the United Nations will be able to really finally do what they need to do to help in the disaggregation of data internationally. We know that our efforts are just the beginning and small efforts, but we hope that this will really be institutionalized, so that the demand for disaggregation will really be fulfilled. I would like to thank again the Indigenous Navigator partners, all of you, for contributing to this effort, and I wish and I hope that we will be able to generate even more resources in the future to continue this exemplary work that we have all been carrying out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vicky, for your very powerful intervention, and particularly on highlighting the critical need for data to support the direct dialogues and discourse between Indigenous peoples, the government, and private sector. The Indigenous Navigator's role in documenting the implementation gap is so vital, and you've really highlighted that. It's particularly crucial to the realization of the SDGs, as you've mentioned, because the Indigenous Navigator is not only collecting data, but it's about implementing small projects to achieve the priorities of the communities themselves, based off of what they have identified by collecting that data. It is now my pleasure to turn to the next session of our event, where we will hear about Indigenous peoples' challenges in relation to data and the realization of their rights. Today we have 4 panelists from the regions of the Arctic, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These panelists will share contributions reflecting on the data gap and the lack of disaggregated data for Indigenous peoples, on challenges in terms of free, prior, informed consent, on monitoring the impact of business operations, and on the role of the Indigenous Navigator as a tool for community-based data collection and the critical role that it can play. Our first speaker is Mr. Ola-Antti Laba. He is a lawyer in the Human Rights Unit of the Sami Council. He is Sami from Enodat in the Finnish part of Sami land. Laba is a lawyer specialized in human rights issues. He has previously worked at the Sami Parliament in Finland and at Minority Rights Group International, a human rights-based organization in London. Ola-Antti, I would like to give the floor to you.
Dear moderators, speakers, and listeners, everyone who is participating to this side event, good morning, day, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I hope that you can hear me and see me well. Thank you for inviting me as a part of this panel. My name is Untitled Chapter, and I am a Sami, and I work as a lawyer in the Human Rights Unit of the Sami Council. I have had an honor to be introduced to the Indigenous Navigator tool during last year. I have been involved in the Indigenous Navigator in SAPMI project. The Indigenous Navigator in SAPMI project is a collaboration of 3 different organizations: the Sami Council, Sami University of Applied Sciences, and IVGIA. This collaboration is facilitated, for example, through regular meetings of the project steering group. Within the framework of this project, we are mapping the legal situation of the indigenous Sami people in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Hopefully also in Russia somewhere in the future, but not under the present conditions. In September 2021, we started implementing national surveys or national questionnaires for Norway and Finland. As most of you know, the Indigenous Navigator tool assesses the realization of the rights of indigenous peoples. So far, in our Indigenous Navigator in SAPMI project, we have been working first on the national questionnaires. The national questionnaires assess the level of recognition and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the respective countries. These questionnaires look particularly at laws, policies, and programs. There are more than 100 questions in the national questionnaire, and topics include, for example, self-determination, land rights, education, and so on. In the Sami context, it's important to map, for example, the differences and similarities on the implementation, or should I say the level of implementation of the indigenous rights in nation states, since SAPMI, Samiland, the area traditionally inhabited by the Sami, is divided by the borders of the 4 nation states: Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. The structures of the Nordic societies, like Finland, Norway, and Sweden, and the legal systems in those aforementioned countries are in principle very similar to others. For example, due to historical reasons, the Finnish legal system is largely based on the system and legal order inherited from the era of the Swedish rule. The indigenous Sami people face similar struggles in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. For example, large land encroachment cases such as mining activities and wind power plants have had an immediate negative impact on the fragile Arctic environment and on the traditional Sami livelihoods. The principle of free, prior, and informed consent has not been recognized and respected in projects that target SAPMI. Also, other forms of discrimination, such as cultural appropriation, which is the misuse of Sami culture, and hate speech toward Sami, exists in all these countries. On the other hand, there are some differences. Finland and Sweden have a so-called dualistic model for ratifying international conventions, whereas Norway employs the so-called monistic model. The dualistic model in Finland and Sweden means that the nation state must first incorporate the obligations imposed by the international conventions into its domestic laws and legal systems to be able to ratify the international conventions. In other words, national law must correspond to the content of an international agreement before it can be ratified. In Norway, on the other hand, there is a largely so-called monistic model of ratifying international conventions. The monistic model means that an international convention as such is part of the legal system of a state, and that domestic law does not necessarily have to be amended for an international convention to be ratified. Just to name a few practical examples of the differences, Norway has ratified the ILO Convention 169 in the year 1990. However, the structural recognition and protection of the indigenous peoples' collective land rights is still an ongoing process in Norway. Sweden and Finland have not ratified the ILO 169 convention. The reason why Finland and Sweden have not yet ratified the convention cannot only be explained by the dualistic model, but it's also politics. In my opinion, it seems to be clear that the main reason for at least Finland not ratifying the ILO Convention 169 has been that the state has not been willing to recognize Sami land rights as the Article 14 of the ILO 169 Convention applies. In Norway and Sweden, as general rule, and with minor exceptions, only the Sami are allowed to practice reindeer herding. The Reindeer Husbandry Act of Finland does not recognize the rights of the Sami people, unlike in Sweden and Norway. In Finland, the right to reindeer herding is practically everyone's right, regardless of ethnicity. The data provided by the Indigenous Navigator can help indigenous Sami communities to monitor the level of implementation of their rights, both on the local level and national level, and to identify the gaps in the implementation in the future. And what kind of data is missing? In my opinion, there is, for example, difficult to find reliable and appropriate statistical data on the Sami. For example, Statistics Finland produces statistics on persons living in Finland according to their nationality, language, and country of birth. According to the Article 9 of the General Data Protection Regulation, which is an EU regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council, the processing of personal data revealing racial or ethnic origin inter alia is prohibited. It's not possible to identify Sami individuals from the statistics of Statistics Finland without the national identity numbers, which is not public information. However, the Indigenous Navigator tool and the questionnaire illustrate what kind of statistics we could obtain from indigenous peoples if national legislation allowed to produce such statistics. Statistics would be of particular importance, for example, in mapping the economic, social, and cultural rights of the indigenous Sami people. I therefore hope that an information mapped so far on these theoretical statistical possibilities could contribute to the development of the statistical work. The data gathering work has been interesting, and I have also learned a lot of new things. I look forward to continuing the project. We still have work to do regarding the national questionnaires, but I am sure that in near future we can also share information regarding the results achieved so far from the project. Hopefully in the future we will be able to implement community service also in Sápmi. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a very nice week.
Thank you, Ola Antti, for helping us better understand the context in Sápmi and the structural differences in the recognition and protection of Indigenous peoples' collective land rights. The call for disaggregated data and the urgent need for reliable and appropriate data for Indigenous peoples is clear, particularly in this context. We'd now like to turn the floor to Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim. She is an environmental activist and a member of Chad's pastoralist Mboro people. She is dedicated to the protection of all Indigenous peoples and to the value of their traditional knowledge in the fight against climate change and biodiversity protection. Hindu is also a member of the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues and the president of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, a member of the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, and UN Sustainable Development Goal Advocate and Conservation International Senior Fellow. Hindu, it's our pleasure to have you today, and I'd like to turn the floor to you for your remarks.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm so sorry to jump in just in the middle. I am currently in the room of the Permanent Forum, as you see the background where I am. I just pull myself back from my colleagues that discussing the closed meeting around how we can do the recommendations. So this topic is really very important for the Permanent Forum and for the members because it is the one we are also discussing today on the afternoon agenda. So always in our agenda, we put the human rights discussions is the bigger one for the Indigenous peoples. So we will be starting this afternoon with the panel with the special rapporteurs on the right of Indigenous peoples and with some human rights agencies that will come and discuss how the right of Indigenous peoples can be improved. So for that one, we hear since yesterday Indigenous peoples from the 7 sociocultural regions reporting how their rights are violated through the environmental issues. Like we hear the project from my my brother from Sami. So we hear a project in the Sami land where there is a big power plant that are being set in Sami land, and then there is also a decision from justice that they couldn't apply it, and then the government couldn't apply it. So then they went to the court, and we hear also the right violations like in Kenya when they steal the land of indigenous communities and also they kicked out the peoples there, and then they went to also to the court, but this one finally like they win the case, but still there is a lot of challenge on the indigenous people rights. And at the same time we hear also in Asia and so many countries that the indigenous people rights are continuously violating. So that's why it is really very important, and especially for me when I see the navigators on how we can monitor and then have the data on the indigenous right violations. So we need that in order to present a concrete case of where it's violating, when, and how much damage that it's happened. So as long as we can document it, and as long as we can have more solutions who can come because we have the evidence that we can show. So I believe that we need the navigators to be in all the regions, and I know exactly also like around my region in Sahel and especially in Chad we did have like a right violation until that people fight and then they kill them, and then when they go report to the justice there will be no case at the end. But if it is monitoring, written down, so indigenous peoples can get a platform either at the Permanent Forum or either the human rights mechanism in Geneva to report it and then to confront the government who are doing the violation or the company that are doing the violations in order to get the reparations. So for the Permanent Forum, what is the next step? We will be having the discussions this week we have like 3 sessions, and every session is 2 hours because it is hybrid, so virtually and in person. So then we will hear from the indigenous peoples, we will hear from the expert, we will be putting a recommendation, but we can't put just like a recommendation, there is a human right violation and then we need action. No, we are putting the recommendation on how we can get it directly monitoring what we put at recommendation, all the action, who is going to take the responsibility, because we know there are so many recommendations at the permanent forum. So we say, no, we are not going to take that anymore. We are going to have the actionable recommendations, and then we know that how we can do the follow-up when it's come for the next years. And second thing we say, as members, we are going to have some countries, we name some countries, we request them to come in the room, and then we ask the question that indigenous peoples raise in the floor. For example, last year we had that Brazil and Colombia and others that we asked the countries, and we have also Bangladesh. So we ask the countries, like we hear from the indigenous peoples, you did A, B, C, D on the right violation. We wanted to hear from you how you did it and how are you going to repair it. And then the country discuss with us around how they're going to repair it. And then we do the follow-up. So like face to face from the members to the countries who violating the right of indigenous peoples. So we don't want to put the IPs on danger, but we take the responsibility as the expert to ask them directly. And then the third thing that during our recommendation and from the first day, I hear that Vicky also talked about it, on the we ask it to meet with the statistic divisions, and then we will do a recommendations also for them. So how the statistic divisions can consider the indigenous people's needs around all the statistic way of right violation, access to development, or monitoring the indigenous people. So a statistic growing up on the country. So then we will be working with them closely. We already have the first meeting with the division of the ECOSOC. So then we will be following up to discussing with them and to work with them closely. And finally, we will be asking some of the organizations, some of the government to be with us, maybe to request for a meeting or workshop or whatever, that we can start a mechanism on how indigenous people's right can be not only in talks, but can be turned up into the policies that we want. So that's all what we have as challenge to work between us with the communities, who are representative here around the permanent forum. So thank you so much for having me. And then I think I will be leaving you soon to go to my colleagues. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Hindu, for this intervention, and thank you for being flexible with us in adjusting your timetable so that you could participate. And tell us a little bit about the work of the Permanent Forum and the future work of the Permanent Forum. It is essential that we keep in mind the impact of business operations on Indigenous peoples, and we hear the urgent call for action on due diligence legislation and policies that can help us to document violations, document attacks, and ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights are not only being implemented at the national level in policy, but are actually being realized by communities on the ground. So thank you so much for this intervention, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, and sorry to leave you, but you already get also what we are doing, and you will follow up in the work of the Permanent Forum during these 2 weeks, and we will be happy also to let you take some part of the recommendation, because we have to implement it also ourselves, and partners like IFGIA and also the others will be really important that you come with us and you support the forum members in this fight. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, who is Shoel Chandra Hajang. Shoel belongs to the Hajang community in Bangladesh, and seeing the injustice and discrimination in his community and the injustices that they faced, he decided to work for an organization which advocates for Indigenous peoples in this area, human rights. Shoel is a Human Rights Program Officer at AIPP, Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and coordinator for the Indigenous Navigator there. He works with a wide range of Asian indigenous communities who are living in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Thailand, Malaysia, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Taiwan, and Japan. Shoel assists indigenous peoples to engage with human rights mechanisms and processes at the national, regional, and international levels, including finalizing and submitting communications and petitions to relevant human rights mechanisms. Shoel, we're very excited to have you today, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your intervention.
Thank you, David. Please allow me to share my screen first.
Yes, if you can try now, you should be able to. Here it's coming on. Yeah, we can see it. Perfect, it's full screen.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you everyone for this opportunity. Now I want to share my presentation on current barriers to participation in free, prior, informed consent and how to overcome them, including a focus on indigenous women. So in my presentation, I will try to cover some agendas like APP and its activities, Indigenous Navigator activities, and what is the epic situation in Asia and current barriers, and also how to overcome these barriers. So this is Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. It is one biggest organizations, indigenous organization in Asia, established in 1992 by Indigenous Peoples Movement, and it works with 46 member organizations in 14 countries, and it has 6 programs in the different specific thematic areas, and it has 5 regional networks. And APP as a consortium partner has been implemented the first phase of Indigenous Navigator project in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Nepal, and it has a lot of significant achievements like Indigenous peoples communities data collection, and strengthening the relationship between indigenous peoples and government bodies and other stakeholders, and making SDGs for indigenous peoples, and access to public social security funds. So this is EPIC. I think we are aware about this EPIC. It is an important mechanism whereby indigenous peoples are able to conduct their own independent collective decision making on matters affecting them. So prior, free, prior informed consent. So free is no pressure. It is fully independently they will take decision. Prior is the consent. What is earlier they need to provide and need to give the consent before the specified activity is authorized. Inform is must. It need to inform with the full and accurate information, and consent is collective and independent decision of community, indigenous communities. And we know we have a lot of international instruments that address this free, prior, informed consent and recognize this for indigenous peoples. We can say UNDP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ILO Convention 169, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and we have other instruments and also international financial instruments who address these EPIC issues. And this is the EPIC situation in Asian countries where we are working for. So, so what is the present condition now? If we tell, we have a lot of international instrument, and we have UNGP, United Nations Guiding Principle on BHR and others documents. But how the EPIC process is followed in the countries? So this is the main concern. But we have seen that no proper utilization, no proper following up of EPIC process among indigenous peoples. And also we can see that when corporate comes in the name of development, actually then we have seen that they are violating indigenous people's rights, and they are extracting and exploiting the resource of indigenous peoples. And another important point is that is the indigenous peoples across the Asia, we have seen that are increasingly subjected to criminalizations. The indigenous peoples who are raising their voice on their rights, and sometimes it is not favored in the government or other important bodies, but we have seen that our indigenous peoples, they're facing many threats, killing, and also they have been criminalized. And it is important thing that in this epic process, we are seeing that indigenous women, they are very absent here. And we have seen in Asian countries, many government and CSOs also don't understand properly the epic process. They are confusing to take any decision and how to following this epic process like that. That's why we have seen much less obtaining IP's content, IP's consent before proceeding this kind of project. And I want to show some cases here because of time limitations. Just this is one case from Bangladesh Madhupur forest area. So forest department is planning to dig an artificial lake in their ancestor area. Then the local indigenous peoples, they are protesting this initiative. And this is the case from Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. Actually, one 5-star Marriott hotel is constructing there, evicting the local Mro indigenous peoples. And we have seen a lot of advocacy, lobby, and campaign of local indigenous peoples, and also AAPP and IBGA and other organizations for these cases. And these cases we have taken from Nepal. This is World Bank and ADB finance 2 projects what are implementing in Nepal without following any free prior informed consent of local indigenous peoples. And this is the important case from Thailand. So we have seen that last year, the World Heritage Committees have taken a dangerous precedent, dangerous example on the declaration of King Krachan Forest Complex in Thailand. This regarding severe cases of reported human rights violations and history of the current indigenous peoples in Thailand. And this is one cases from plainland of Bangladesh. This is Bagda Farm area, where 5 years ago, the sugar mill authority and the security person evicted the local Santal indigenous peoples, and they have made fire on their houses and killed 3 people. And now again, the government is planning to set up a largest export processing zone in this area. So now the question is, what is the barrier actually to participate in this epic process? So we can say that the lack of a national legislation recognizing indigenous peoples, because we have international instrument, but lack of the national policy and legislations, the epic is not implemented in the countries. And also indigenous peoples, their customary laws and self-determination, self-government system is also not respected and recognized at the country level. And still indigenous people's capacities are not so strong to fight, to deal these cases, and no actually proper guideline or strategy what indigenous people will follow at the local level to deal this case, and a lack of access to adequate data information. We have facing these problems, and this is actually very important barriers focusing on indigenous women. We see the indigenous women is also a marginalized group among indigenous peoples, but they are left behind, mostly left behind in the epic process. And also we have seen that they are not actually benefited, because all the benefits and compensations go to men, but indigenous women, they are facing a lot of problems with increasing their workload, lack of their technical knowledge and advocacy skills also, they are not fit to deal this kind of epic process. And also we have seen that women's security issue is important because indigenous women are still facing the violence against indigenous peoples, a lot of cases in Asian countries. And when this kind of project come, we have seen that the tourism or project area can bring increased alcohol, sex workers, and violence into them. Now the question is how to overcome the barriers. So to overcome these barriers, I have some recommendations to different stakeholders. So I have recommendations to indigenous people and CSO, recommendation to state, recommendation to financial institutions. So for the indigenous peoples, actually, we need to work for an effective strategy to follow how we can follow this strategy and deal this kind of business and human rights issues. And we need to strengthen actually in community people's capacity. We need to generate the data. It is very important, and Indigenous Navigator project is doing that. And also analytical skill, and need to translate and localize our epic documents and guiding principles as well. And for the state, actually state can play a great role. No, state can ratify the ILO Convention 169 and UN declarations, also the UN guiding principles, and they can enact their own legislation, action plan, what will be important for the indigenous peoples to implement this epic process. And also indigenous territories, their self-determination, their customary laws need to be respected and recognized by the country and state. So recommendation for the corporate sector. So it is also very important, the corporate sector, because they invest a lot of money for this. Corporations should commit to respect international standard of indigenous peoples, and corporations need to adopt the policies which clarify their human rights obligations under international standards, irrespective of national legislation, and engage in comprehensive dialogue between indigenous peoples and the company people. And lastly, act on human rights due diligence assessment. It is also need to consider by the companies. So these recommendations for these three specific stakeholders, but we have other mechanism like UN mechanism, Indigenous Navigator, international development agencies. So we can help to take a necessary initiative to implement this for the indigenous peoples. So this was the presentation. Thanks all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joel, for a very interesting and powerful presentation, and for giving us concrete examples of how Indigenous peoples are being impacted, not only in terms of understanding how FPIC is being realized, but also on the situation of Indigenous women, who are often invisible and, as you've said, remain unconsulted, not consulted in matters that affect them. Thank you as well for helping us to understand how you've been using the Indigenous Navigator and how it has supported you and your partners and Indigenous peoples on the ground to claim their rights, and particularly for highlighting the lack of national legislation recognizing Indigenous peoples and their rights to FPIC, as well as the issues that they face in their self-determination and the lack of access to adequate and correct information. I think it's particularly striking that we acknowledge this, but also that you give such excellent concrete recommendations of what we can add and the value that we can bring to these discussions. It is now my pleasure to turn to our next speaker, who is Timothy Amini from Okani in Cameroon. Timothy will be presenting in French, so if you need interpretation, this is a reminder to please use the globe at the bottom of the Zoom window to select your interpretation channel. Timothy works with Association Okani in Cameroon. And I'm sorry, excuse me. Sorry,
Bonsoir,
we had a
bonjour
yes.
à tous les panélistes et merci David pour l'opportunité que nous offrez en tant que peuple autochtone des forêts du Cameroun. Vous allez peut-être excuser parce que on est en pleine période de pluie au Cameroun et du coup les pluies peuvent tomber à tout moment et du coup vous pourriez écouter en fond sonore quelques bruits de pluie. On s'en excuse, c'est la nature qui s'impose à ce que nous faisons actuellement. Alors, comme David l'a dit, je suis Émile Timothée Aurélien. Je travaille pour l'association Okani, qui est une organisation des peuples autochtones basée dans la région de l'Est du Cameroun. Et nous travaillons dans l'ensemble sur les questions de protection, de promotion des droits humains des peuples autochtones. Et nous avons eu, principalement moi, comme responsable de mise en œuvre du projet Navigateur autochtone au Cameroun. Et cela est arrivé à point nommé parce que les peuples autochtones du Cameroun ne vivent pas dans un fleuve tranquille parce qu'il y a toujours des questions de discrimination, des violations des droits humains des peuples autochtones, surtout lorsqu'on se retrouve dans les situations de spoliation des terres et des forêts relativement aux aires protégées. Ça, c'est un peu la vision globale qu'on peut avoir du Cameroun et surtout en ce qui concerne les droits des communautés autochtones des forêts et même des Mboro en général. Alors, pour ce qui est concrètement du navigateur autochtone, cet outil est arrivé au Cameroun comme un sauveur parce que jusque-là, nous avions des difficultés à démontrer avec des preuves, des données actualisées pour aller dans des questions de lobby, de plaidoyer au niveau national. Mais à travers le navigateur autochtone, nous avons pu mener sur le terrain une collecte de données avec l'application d'un questionnaire qui nous a permis au moins de déchiffrer une situation très difficile dans laquelle les communautés se trouvent, à savoir la question de l'accès à la citoyenneté. Et lorsqu'on a fini d'appliquer ce questionnaire, on s'est rendu compte que la question de la citoyenneté et spécifiquement sur les questions d'acte de naissance se posait avec acuité. Je voudrais rappeler qu'au Cameroun, l'acte de naissance est la chose cruciale qui ouvre les portes à toutes les questions de citoyenneté. Vous ne pouvez pas évoluer dans la société camerounaise si à la base, juridiquement, vous n'êtes pas identifié comme Camerounais à travers une déclaration de naissance qui est bien établie par une commune au niveau local. Et donc, le fait que les autochtones, les communautés autochtones n'aient pas ce précieux instrument juridique fait en sorte que les communautés sont à tout moment exposées aux violations parce que ne pouvant pas prévaloir leur identité à travers cet instrument qui est important. Et donc, le navigateur autochtone est venu faciliter la contribution de la mise en œuvre de l'objectif de développement numéro 16, qui est un objectif qui permet au renforcement durable de la paix, de la justice et des institutions efficaces au niveau des pays. Et nous avons donc mis en œuvre à travers le navigateur cette contribution à l'ODD 16 et cela nous a permis, n'est-ce pas, d'avoir des messages de plaidoyer pour que les questions des peuples autochtones soient effectivement prises en compte au niveau national et plus loin au niveau international. Alors, de 2018 à 2021, nous avons donc procédé à cette collecte de données et nous nous sommes rendus compte que 69% d'enfants autochtones de moins de 5 ans n'ont pas d'acte de naissance. Ça, c'est vraiment au niveau de l'enfance. Et nous voulons relever que c'est 2 fois la moyenne nationale. Et nous nous sommes aussi rendus compte à travers cette collecte de données que 47% des peuples autochtones sont sans citoyenneté reconnue et 36% des peuples autochtones sont sans carte d'électeur et donc ne peuvent pas participer à la vie politique dans notre pays, le Cameroun. Et donc, l'établissement de l'acte de naissance était une priorité dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre du navigateur autochtone au Cameroun. Et plus loin, si on parle d'acte de naissance, ça renvoie aussi, n'est-ce pas, à la déclaration de la carte nationale d'identité, parce qu'au Cameroun, pour avoir la carte nationale d'identité, il faut au préalable avoir un acte de naissance. Alors, ce document fondamental qui permet que les droits des communautés autochtones puissent être respectés, puissent être pris en compte, a donc été le cheval de bataille dans notre micro-projet pilote qui a été facilité par le navigateur autochtone. Et quelques obstacles. Il y a une faible détention de ces documents. Il y a une faible politique nationale d'intégration des peuples autochtones dans la sphère politico-administrative. Et aussi, il y a l'absence d'une loi nationale sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Et ça donne aussi un faible intérêt des leaders autochtones à contribuer passionnément au jeu politique. Nous avons donc opté pour 500 actes de naissance. Et actuellement, nous sommes allés vers les résultats probants. 420 actes de naissance ont été établis par jugement supplétif et 160 actes de naissance ont été établis par déclaration directe. Les quelques leçons apprises que nous avons énumérées dans ce processus, c'est que tant que les communautés autochtones n'auront pas suffisamment les informations sur la situation des états civils, ce sera difficile pour elles d'évoluer. Il faut beaucoup de temps et de patience pour conduire un processus d'état civil. La transcription des décisions de justice dans les registres d'état civil et des mairies est assez lourde et éprouvante. Et aussi, nous avons constaté qu'il y a un plaidoyer à faire au niveau du Cameroun. À l'État du Cameroun, nous avons adressé quelques recommandations. Que l'État ouvre des centres d'état civil secondaires à proximité avec les communautés autochtones, que les autorités locales établissent les leaders autochtones aptes à écrire comme des secrétaires d'état civil, que l'État doit systématiquement organiser des audiences foraines dans les localités retirées des centres urbains, que l'État doit systématiquement appliquer la politique d'indulgence dans les services des palais de justice lors de l'instruction des droits des peuples autochtones aux fins des actes de naissance. Nous avons aussi quelques remerciements à tous les donateurs de ce projet navigateur autochtone et nous pourrons dire toute notre gratitude à IFJI et bien d'autres partenaires qui ont soutenu jusqu'ici, mais sauf qu'il y a encore une forte demande parce que c'était certainement un micro-projet pilote, mais il y a encore une grosse demande pour que les expériences que nous avons implémentées dans une zone puissent être étendues vers d'autres. Merci David et merci à tous les panélistes pour votre aimable attention. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for this excellent presentation. Particularly, we'd like to thank you for all of the work that you do, your representation, and we'd also like to share a couple of links that we've put in the chat about these wonderful videos and the media that you've produced about this project for our audience to follow up on. In the interest of time, I need to move on quickly, so I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Melania Canales-Poma. Melania is the current president of the National Organization of Indigenous and Amazonian Women in Peru, ONAMIAP. Born in the Andean province of Lucanas, Ayacucho, Ms. Canales leads the capacity building program of ONAMIAP, focusing on women's representation within and outside their communities, and has represented them internationally in several of the United Nations Climate Conference meetings. Thanks to her work, many indigenous communities have modified their internal regulations, allowing women to participate in decision-making, acquire land tenure, and become community representatives. Thank you, Melania, and thank you to our panelists so far. I'd like to give you the floor, Melania.
Muchas gracias, David. Alimpuncho, Cachumillapalaichita. Bien, yo quisiera saludar a cada uno de ustedes y a la misma vez también, presentar el trabajo que venimos haciendo conjuntamente con IFJI y también este trabajo de navegador indígena, que me parece una experiencia bien interesante, bien importante, al menos para nosotras, ¿no? La desagregación de los datos que se viene haciendo es para visibilizar justamente los problemas más graves, ¿no? Lo más graves que tenemos como pueblos y mujeres indígenas, y como resultado tenemos las múltiples vulneraciones de los derechos individuales y colectivos de los pueblos y mujeres indígenas. Ya sabemos que el navegador indígena es una herramienta que permite a los pueblos y mujeres indígenas hacer un seguimiento de los progresos obtenidos, ¿no? Sobre todo en la aplicación de las normas internacionales en lo que respecta a los derechos, así como el Convenio 169, la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Pues esta herramienta cuenta con un cuestionario comunitario basada en indicadores de procesos y resultados, ¿no? Al que responde las propias comunidades mediante evaluación colectiva, y también la recopilación de datos es en el terreno, en el mismo lugar, en la propia comunidad, ¿no? Las técnicas empleadas para el recojo de esta información han sido pues discusiones en grupos focales, ¿no? Primeramente, siempre hacemos esas reuniones con nuestras hermanas, las mujeres indígenas, y luego en grupos mixtos en asambleas comunales, ¿no? Esos son más o menos las técnicas que se recogen. Y pues, bien, lo que se ha podido obtener, por ejemplo, a raíz, resultado de estos cuestionarios, ¿no? Que se visibiliza en todo, es la discriminación estructural, ¿no? En el caso del derecho a la igualdad y la no discriminación, la gran mayoría de las mujeres y varones indígenas que responden al cuestionario, ¿no? Ellos consideran que han sido o siguen siendo discriminados permanentemente. Sobre todo en el acceso al servicio que brinda el Estado. Ese acceso al servicio, estamos hablando de salud, educación, justicia, identidad cultural, entre otras. Esta discriminación pues se expresa, ¿no? De diversos modos. Se expresa, a veces no se la atiende, ¿no? No se la atiende, hay un maltrato. Hay un maltrato y muchas veces ven solo económico, entre otros. Y tiene pues su origen en esto tiene su origen también, que hay que verlo por algunas variables, como de género, ¿no? Y también los ingresos, como estamos diciendo, monetarios. Y respecto al ejercicio del derecho a la igualdad, sobre todo por parte de las mujeres de las comunidades, se evidencia que las mujeres siguen sufriendo múltiples violencias, ¿no? Formas de violencia interseccionales de discriminación. Es más, en la mayoría de las comunidades se constata que existe una alta cifra de violencia física, sexual, psicológica en contra de las mujeres indígenas, ejercida por nuestros propios hermanos indígenas, pero también por terceros, ¿no? Y esto aún se agrava con la impunidad, ¿no? Y la normalización de estas violencias. Todas las violencias prácticamente están normalizadas, ahí no pasa nada, ¿no? Entonces, eso en principio lo que se viene visibilizando, ¿no? Pero asimismo también cuando empezamos a ver otros derechos como el derecho al territorio, ¿no? A pesar de que de los diversos problemas que enfrentan las comunidades, tienen claro que la propiedad del territorio es colectivo y no individual, ¿no? Porque y en esos territorios vienen haciendo sus prácticas, costumbres, van desarrollando sus conocimientos, su ciencia, su tecnología, ¿no? Pero mantienen una relación única, como se dice los pueblos indígenas, con el territorio. Pero la gran mayoría de las comunidades no cuentan con títulos o seguridad jurídica del territorio. El Estado brinda la propiedad de la tierra, pero no del territorio. Por eso muchas veces, donde están los bosques, los ríos, las montañas, no los titula, solamente le da en cesión de uso. O sea, no hay una titulación integral del territorio. Y a esto también se suma, se puede decir, el despojo territorial. A esto se suma la contaminación ambiental producidas por actividades forestales, la pesca, el petróleo, la minería, ¿no? Y es grave porque va contaminando la tierra, que ya no produce, va contaminando los ríos, que ya no hay alimento en los ríos, ¿no? Entonces, inclusive en las comunidades se identificó la contaminación por los residuos sólidos, ¿no? Los residuos sólidos, los plásticos, que el consumismo, pues bueno, ahí está y son arrojados al río. Asimismo, también hemos podido ver, cuando hablamos de libre determinación y autonomía, ¿no? Los integrantes de las comunidades en el cuestionario han manifestado que sí, pues internamente tienen su autonomía, tienen sus propias normas, como sus estatutos, sus reglamentos, ¿no? Y hay diversas prácticas en la propia comunidad, aún la minca, por ejemplo, ¿no? Que practican sus faenas, tienen sus asambleas, sus reuniones comunales, ¿no? Pero sin embargo, las comunidades dicen que las entidades del Estado, ¿no? No le respetan su autonomía, por ejemplo, su autonomía al territorio. Y no por esa falta de respeto, también no les proporciona recursos necesarios para la implementación y cumplimiento de sus planes de vida, planes comunales que las comunidades tienen. Entonces, toda la idea de desarrollo viene de afuera. No les toma en cuenta a las comunidades, ¿no? Entonces, ahí se ve también cómo autonomía y libre determinación pues está siendo afectado. Y más aún cuando hablamos de consulta y consentimiento, ¿no? En la gran mayoría pues que hemos podido identificar, a las comunidades no conocen sobre consulta, nunca se les ha hecho consulta, ni el gobierno local, regional, nacional, nada. Las mujeres aún más hay un desconocimiento. Y si hay en algunas comunidades que han hecho consulta, pero son mínimas, pues no lo hacen de buena fe. Muchas veces hay imposiciones de planes de consulta. No les informa las afectaciones y lo hacen en un corto tiempo. O sea, tampoco miran la agenda de los pueblos, o sea, como se dice, sus tiempos, sino que el Estado impone sus tiempos desde arriba. Entonces, eso se ha visto, ¿no? Entonces, por eso que hay muchos concesiones mineras, petroleras, otorgadas por Estado, han sido sin garantizar estos derechos, ¿no? Y estas situaciones, pues, ha producido conflictos, ha producido impactos culturales, sociales, ambientales en los territorios de los pueblos indígenas. Pues estos muchas veces, o muchas veces no, peligra, lo que dice peligra la propia subsistencia de los pueblos. Y es un peligro también para la seguridad y soberanía alimentaria, ¿no? Entonces, y asimismo, cuando empezamos a ver de las violencias y de la desprotección del Estado, en la gran mayoría de las comunidades se constata la omisión de diversos crímenes en contra de sus integrantes, que muchas veces ni los medios de comunicación lo perciben. Hay asesinatos por la defensa del territorio y hay ingresos a los territorios, ¿no? De narcotraficantes, talas ilegales y por ejemplo, en la Amazonía, los madereros, ¿no? Que gravemente, pues, vienen amenazando y bueno, pues no hay una verdadera salvaguarda a la vida, integridad de los, en este caso de los pueblos que defienden sus territorios. A pesar de que existe una obligación por parte del Estado peruano en materia de igualdad y no discriminación, por ejemplo, a la fecha las mujeres indígenas continúan enfrentando distintas formas de discriminación por ser indígena, por ser mujer, por sus ingresos o medios económicos, por su edad. Las violencias hacia las mujeres más aún está normalizado, ¿no? Y bueno, y cuando hablamos de servicios básicos, hay carencia en la prestación de los servicios básicos, culturalmente apropiados, se puede decir, cuando hablamos de salud intercultural, educación intercultural, ¿no? Pues hay carencia. Y entonces eso también lleva a una vulneración de derechos. Y más aún, estos servicios se agudizan con la pandemia, o se ha agudizado con el inicio de la pandemia, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que esto nos ha podido visibilizar, pero también hacer recomendaciones al Estado. Y creo que el navegador indígena para nosotros es muy importante, ¿no? Es muy importante para visibilizar estos grandes problemas. Nos pasaríamos hablando justamente, todavía hay mucho que hablar sobre seguridad, participación política, ¿no? Cómo estamos en desventaja, ¿no? En participación política, ni siquiera se toma en cuenta dentro de los gobiernos locales, regionales, la participación de pueblos indígenas. No hay, la seguridad y soberanía alimentaria no se está implementando, ¿no? Entonces, ni se fortalece. Entonces, son cosas que se tiene que nosotras también seguir exigiendo, demandando al Estado, ¿no? Haciendo incidencia, y el Estado también pueda ver estos resultados de desprotección de derechos hacia pueblos y mujeres indígenas. Muchas gracias. No quisiera hablar mucho. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Melania, for this extremely powerful and detailed intervention, and for sharing with us particularly the challenges that are being faced by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women in Peru, but also all around the world. It's very interesting to better understand how we can follow up on the progress obtained by international mechanisms and laws that protect Indigenous peoples' rights, and particularly the implementation gap. The community questionnaire, answers that are developed with a collective assessment with the communities and by the communities themselves through focus group discussions, as you've said, and through community meetings, are essential. We have to highlight and platform these voices to be sure that they are heard. Further, the challenges in structural discrimination, inequality, lack of access to social services, health, education, and access to fundamental freedoms that Indigenous peoples have a right to enjoy. These are critical issues that must be addressed. We also have to remember that violence against women, different forms of violence, whether it be psychological, sexual, or physical, are happening every day, and we must all do more to ensure that we address them and that we call them out and that we answer to them. So thank you so much, Melania. The call to do more is heard loud and clear, and we are very glad to have you. Our final intervention today is by Sebastian Porter from the European Commission. He's from the European Commission's Directorate General, INTPA, International Partnerships, Unit G1. Sebastian Porter is the program manager in G1, and he works on the topic of business and human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights. He previously has worked with human rights defenders in Central Africa, and we're very glad to give him the final word of the day. Sebastian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thanks to everyone. I'll be wary of time. I think it was important that we heard today's testimonies. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you're doing well. I think it's for me also a great honor to support the work on the Indigenous Navigator. And as I said, it was important to hear testimonies from our partners on the ground. The EU is very proud to support the Indigenous Navigator. I mean, for us, it's our flagship project to support Indigenous people's rights worldwide. And I think today's contribution clearly highlighted the critical role played by the Indigenous Navigator. So I won't cover them all, but I think it's interestingly, it builds up with another permanent forum side event that was held yesterday on FPIC. And actually the board consensus was that development priorities must be designed by Indigenous peoples themselves if we want impactful climate change mitigation actions. And I think this highlights the relevancy of the Navigator. So for the EU, I mean, besides our long-standing political support to Indigenous people's rights, EU external action also abides to a human rights-based approach. And therefore, promoting Indigenous disaggregated data, for us, it's part of the human rights-based approach DNA, and therefore highly important. So we are currently looking into new ways to further build up the Navigator, either by increasing its use by a wide range of development actors, but also to explore new frontiers. I think some partners highlighted this, that we need to look into new countries, new communities, and this will make the Navigator a truly global tool. However, I mean, the EU can provide its support, but we cannot do it alone. And to link up to the framework of the Permanent Forum, on our side, we've been taking note of the successive recommendation made by the Permanent Forum in the latest session about the importance of Indigenous-based data collection and monitoring. So the EU recognizes the value of this recommendation, and we do act upon it through the Navigator. However, we believe there's an opportunity to take stock of this recommendation and do more. And I think Indu also underlined this point, and I hope this will be discussed. So for example, the recommendation could be put in the framework of the Permanent Forum as part of their mandates, for example, by setting up a technical discussion with national statistical offices and UN agencies. I think this could also help the Navigator achieve more sustainability, because everyone agrees how relevant it is and how helpful it is for Indigenous communities. And then a final point, I would like to link back to the overarching of the 21st session. And I'm making these recommendations for the Permanent Forum because we believe time is ripe and there's a momentum to seize. You might have heard of the recent legislative proposal by the EU Commission to set up binding human rights and environmental due diligence requirements on both large-scale EU and non-EU companies. And so this means that data itself will have more importance and value for companies as they have to identify and mitigate risks. But we have to make sure that this data is not biased. And therefore, because we all know the well-known adverse impact that companies have on the Indigenous communities, it's important that we already strategize how Indigenous data can confront companies to the realities of their ground operation. So I'll leave it to that, but thank you very much for your time and for everyone's participation. Back to you, David.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for this very important call to follow up in the coming year, in 2022 and 2023, on the recommendations as well as the urgent need to continue work on disaggregating data on Indigenous peoples and the realization of Indigenous peoples' rights. As we mentioned at the beginning of the event, one of the critical issues that we face is that the world as a whole lacks the full picture of the marginalization and discrimination that Indigenous peoples experience. There is a dearth of disaggregated data and a critical gap in terms of tools and resources to engage comprehensively and securely on Indigenous peoples' rights and all of the issues that are contained within. As the human rights-based approach to development has shown, if there's no disaggregated data on Indigenous peoples and no effort to ensure they are included in digital transformations, then they will remain invisible. Their rights will continue to be disregarded in the context of implementing the SDGs, and they will be left behind. We must work to ensure that that does not happen. So we thank you very much for joining us today. We thank our speakers and each of you who have intervened for your words and for your action, and we very much look forward to the rest of the Permanent Forum, and we encourage you to reach out to us at any time, and we'd love to talk to you. Thank you so much. With that, we'll formally close the event.